Hi. So we're going to talk about deviance today. What is more deviant than Darth Vader? Oh, sorry. I didn't really have any cool things to show you to get started other than my Darth Vader and my Stormtrooper bobbleheads. But really, what is more deviant than these two dudes, right? Like, this is a lot of stuff, a lot of backstory. Anyway, let's talk about deviance. So, question. Are you deviant? Have you ever broken a law? Some of you may be saying, yep. Some of you may be saying, I'm a perfect angel. I never do anything wrong. To you, I say, okay, have you ever crested the speed limit and gone past it? Right? Have you ever sped in your life? Have you ever jaywalked? Have you ever crossed the street before the little white street crossing sign popped up? Right? All of those things are deviant because technically all of them are breaking the law. Deviance doesn't necessarily mean lawbreaker, which we're going to talk about. But my point is that we are all deviant in some way. We've all done deviant stuff in some way. Deviance is actions that do not conform to the values or norms of a society. And this is any action. This can be anything, chewing gum in the wrong place, to murder, to beyond. Any action that's outside of a social norm is considered deviant. So, for example, you can't tell right now. I might not be wearing pants. Would that be deviant if I stood up? Yeah, totally. Most of you get dressed when you leave the house in the morning. Thank you, by the way, for wearing clothes out in public. If you didn't, one, you'd be arrested, and two, it'd be pretty deviant. Just, walking around in your nakedness. Any action that does not conform to the values of a society is deviant. And if you've ever done something like, take your family, for example, if you've ever done something that's outside of the family or outside of what your family thinks is acceptable, and they've greeted you with maybe they say like, well, that's different. Well, that's not normal. That's weird, right? You've been deviant in some way. Deviance can mean a lot of different things. I gave you this example when I talked about culture of Michael Fay. This was the kid man now who was caned in Singapore in the 90s for throwing eggs at cars and graffitiing them. Here's what he looked like in the 90s. This is deviant, right? Going into another culture or another society and not understanding their laws and then doing what you want anyway. That's an act of deviance. When we're talking about deviance in sociology, sociologists are going to stress that deviance is something we learn. So we've learned how to be deviant. We act accordingly to how we've learned to handle different situations. And we're influenced by that whole list of social factors that I gave you back at the beginning of lecture. Religion, family life, our peers, our media, all sorts of stuff influences us and lets us know or gives an indication of how deviant we're going to be. Now, this doesn't mean that you watch like one movie where people are like, Darth Vadering other people and you suddenly become a murderer. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that we learn behavior based off of how we see behavior modeled for us. And deviance is another example of that. So there's two types of deviance. There is primary deviance. This is what someone has done that causes them to be labeled as deviant. Secondary deviance. It's when you've accepted that label and you act accordingly. So primary deviance is what you did. It could be you stole a car. It could be you broke curfew. It could be you cheated on a test. It could be you wore a piece of clothing your parents said, absolutely not, do not leave the house wearing that, right? Whatever action you did, that's your primary deviance. Your secondary deviance is when you have accepted the label of deviant and you start to act accordingly. Say, for example, you leave the house in a piece of clothing your parents don't like, and they say, oh, you're going to get a certain reputation if you wear that outside of the home, right? Or better yet, in schools where they say to girls, hey, you need to cover up. You need to cover up your shoulders or your legs or whatever, because just you and your body is deviant. You may say, all right, cool. I'm deviant then. I'm going to wear this skirt if I want to. I'm going to dress the way I want to. If that's a deviant, then I'm okay with that. It's when you've accepted that label and you carry on with it and kind of in sort of saying, I don't care to everybody else. Deviance comes from power, just like most of the tough stuff in sociology. Power is the ability to control your environment. So Michel Foucault came up with that definition of power. He wrote a book called Discipline and Punish. This was in the 70s. In Discipline and Punish, he talked about what is called a panopticon. Now, a panopticon is basically a structure that, or an ideology, but for our cases, we'll say a structure that allows you to see everything that's happening around you, but the people you are watching can't necessarily see you. So if you've ever driven past a prison or a jail, you'll notice that all of them tend to have some sort of tower somewhere. And this is specifically set up to so that prisoners can be seen and not necessarily see who's watching them. Panopticons exist in a lot of different ways. One example, Foucault also said, power is natural. We don't need guards to police us. In other words, we've become very good on our own as a society of deciding what is right and what is wrong, and we enforce that. So, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, people who were out in public without masks or without gloves may have faced a little bit of adversity about that, right? That not wearing a mask means that you don't care about other people's health or something like that. And someone may have said something to you. You don't necessarily need a police officer or someone in law enforcement to police you. Here's another example. Your phone. So when you are out in public and you're taking pictures of whatever you're taking a picture of with your phone, you're probably not paying attention a whole lot to who else is in that frame with you. It's probably just either you and your friend or something. And that's because we've become very used to seeing something awesome in public, pulling out our phone, taking a picture, taking a video, and being like, haha, loading it up to Insta and going about our day, tweeting it, whatever. We've become very used to that. And Foucault would say this is an example of a modern day panopticon, right? When I'm out in public, I can't tell you if somebody is videoing me or taking my picture at every moment that I'm out. But I assume that if someone has their phone out, there's a good chance that I'm in a picture somewhere, right? This is a modern panopticon. You don't know who is watching you, but they know they're watching you. This has been used in a couple of different ways to society's benefit, I guess we could make the argument. One is with the Boston Marathon bombing that happened a few years ago. The way that they tracked the men who set off the bombs was by the FBI saying to people, hey, we think that this happened in this area of Boston, so in this sort of block structure. If you were there in this junction at this specific set of time, could you please send us your cell phone videos and pictures? And people did. They sent in hundreds of cell phone videos and pictures. The FBI combed through them, and that's how they figured out who the men were. That's how they got kind of a picture of who they were and at what point in time they placed it, and kind of got facial recognition from it. And that's because of a modern day panopticon. Another example of this is anytime you set foot into a theme park, Disney, Universal, I don't care. Anytime you set foot into a theme park, you are being watched by cameras, by people in plain clothes, right? This is a modern panopticon. We can come up with negative approaches to it because it is a power structure, right? And power structures aren't always to the benefit of oppressed groups. They're usually for the benefit of dominant groups. But I think these are good kind of contemporary ways to think about what a panopticon is. So when we're talking about theory, the structural functionalist theory of deviance comes from Emile Durkheim. So he's going to say deviance is normal and it is necessary because it gives us boundaries. And he's also going to say that deviance, the result of deviance, or people acting deviantly, is the result of a lack of moral regulations in a society. Meaning that if people are acting deviant, functionalist theory says, well, that's because we haven't pointed people in the right direction enough. And this is kind of contentious, right? Because deviance can incorporate a lot of different things. Also, it connects with anomie. So remember I was talking to you about anomie way back when we first started class. And I said that anomie is a state of normlessness, right? Meaning that we no longer have norms. When social norms no longer apply to a person's behavior. And when we're talking about deviant behavior, if you decide that the rules no longer apply to you, then the sky is the limit for the stuff that you can do. Whether or not you get away with it or you get caught and you get punished, totally other story. But once you've decided rules don't apply to me, it's fine. I'm going to do whatever I want. you have to be able to accept the repercussions for your actions, but you've entered a state of normlessness. So conflict theory looks at deviance as a choice, but it also looks at power. Again, we're talking about power structures. So conflict theory is going to say that people engage in deviant behavior when a system leaves them with very few alternatives. If you're a fan of Les Miserables, like myself, you will know that the beginning of the story that Valjean steals bread to feed his family and gets caught stealing and then ends up, doing the time as 24601. This is a choice that was made in response to a system that oppressed him. Couldn't get food, was poor, couldn't afford it, stole bread, ended up in jail. Or a chain gang, whatever you want to call it. This is what conflict theory is getting at, that people make deviant decisions because the system has left them with no alternative. So when you see people protesting or rallying against something, say, for example, the government, this is what conflict theory would say is, yeah, they have to do that. They have to act deviant because there's nothing else left for them to do. There's no more options for them. Conflict theory argues that laws are created for the privileged, meaning that a law is created to benefit people who have power and have privilege, and that those laws can then maintain power over people who do not have privilege. You all watched 13th, so you all sort of saw how the criminal justice system is created to the benefit of some at the expense of others. That's what conflict theory is getting at. So I have a couple of examples of conflict theory for you. Number one is kneeling, right? We saw a lot of controversy with football players kneeling that was weighed in by everyone from the NFL to the president. Another example, and I'm going to put this on Canvas for you in this week's lecture, is the Childish Gambino video, This Is America. So take a second, watch This Is America. I suspect a lot of you have already seen it. And when you come back, I will carry on. Here is your elegant pose for while you put me on pause. I think I look like a painting. I'm not sure. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you've watched Childish Gambino, because it also can apply to symbolic interaction. So symbolic interaction is going to branch off a little bit when we talk about deviance and address labeling theory. So labeling theory says that deviance is not found in the act, but rather in the label that's applied. So it's not necessarily the action that you do that makes you deviant. It's how, according to symbolic interaction, it's how people see you after the fact that label you as deviant. So here is an example that is a little extreme, but I hope it serves the point. So you're in a relationship and your spouse is severely abusing you, right? Like you are being beaten, you are having emotional support withheld, you're having financial support hung over your head. If you leave me, you won't be able to make any money. And one night you snap and you kill them, okay? You now have the label of murderer applied to you, right? May not be fair in terms of what led up to that moment, but labeling theory says that your deviance was not necessarily the action, but now the way you're seen by people. This is labeling theory. Strain theory, a little bit different, still kind of in the same avenue. Strain theory says that there are goals that we should all be achieving. So there's certain expectations and goals that we should all be achieving as a society. When we don't get that, we feel frustrated. And we usually act out in a way that allows us to achieve those goals, but may not be completely okay, right? Maybe deviant. So thus a person feels strained, according to strain theory. Someone feels strained when they know there's something they're supposed to be achieving and they can't. So here's an example. Say you want the new iPhone. All your friends have it. Everybody's getting it. You want it. It does something amazing. My dream is that the iPhone will turn us all into holograms, but that's just me. But say you want the new iPhone and it's called iPhone, 54, whatever number we're at. You can't afford it because iPhones are really expensive. All your friends have it. So you go to class one day, and as you're leaving, you realize that one of your classmates has left behind their iPhone. And you look at it and you think, I could give this back to them, or I could take it. You elect to take it because you want to get in on the fun with all of your friends. You take it, you clear it, you do everything you need to do to make that phone yours, and ta-da, you've got yourself a new iPhone. This is an example of strain theory. Something that everyone else had, you wanted to achieve, you couldn't get there, you did whatever you could to get it because you felt strained. When we're talking about deviance, sanctions are the result of your behavior. So what's going to happen to you after you've broken the law, committed an act of deviance? There's two types of sanctions. There are formal sanctions. These are the official ways that you'll be punished, right? So, for example, we have the court system, right? That's an official way you'll be punished. If you're in school, you have the principal's office. That's an official way you'll be punished. Informal sanctions are a little different. Informal sanctions are the way that your community, your family, your friends are going to react to what you did. And I want you to take a minute and really, really think that if you did something wrong, if you broke a law, if you got caught cheating on some sort of test and you had to take an F in a class, if you did those things, which would be worse for you? Formal sanctions or informal sanctions? If your answer is formal sanctions, I would like to say to you, do you have parents who are really good at making you feel bad for stuff you've done? If your answer is informal sanctions, I would say, does the court system concern you at all? And, what we know about the criminal justice system. So what would be worse for you? Formal, informal, completely up to you. When we're talking about deviance and crime, I like to talk about hegemonic masculinity because, as I'm going to show you in the next slide, the majority of violent crime are committed by men. Violent crime in general has gone downhill. There's been less over the last few decades, but what has stayed completely the same and consistently is the majority of violent crime is committed by men. This is something that's not talked about as much as it should be, but it is the one common thread amongst almost all violent crime. So when we talk about this, we talk about hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity means that someone is the dominant group. Hegemonic means that there is a dominant position. All hegemonic means is a dominant position that you are trying to hold onto. You want to keep that dominant position. So you are in a state of hegemony or hegemonic. Hegemonic masculinity then means that manhood is considered the dominant position. And for men, you're being expected to stick with this hegemonic masculine behavior, that you are expected to stay within hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity means that men should be dominant, decides what it means to be a man. Don't cry, don't show emotion, be superior at all times to women and men. And it has marked moments in a man's lifespan. So for those of you who are listening who are men, I suspect you could probably tell me about a time when someone said to you, like, boys don't cry, or don't be so emotional, or that's only for girls to do, right? And women have the same experience, but we're talking about men right now. These are all things that take a hold in hegemonic masculinity and are part of the reason why men end up acting out in some sort of violent way. So, how much of violence is committed by men? A whole heck of a lot. So we've got 86% of armed robberies, 90% of murder, 87% of stalkers, 99% of rape, 77% of aggravated assaults, 86% of domestic violence, 87% of firearm suicides. Men are more likely to die by firearm suicide than women. And then at the time that this data was collected, we have 61 of 62 mass shootings. Now, mass shootings are interesting. All but one in the history of the United States, all but one mass shooting have been perpetrated by men. And the one mass shooting perpetrated by a woman was done, I want to say, in the late 70s, early 80s. And she ended up being labeled as severely mentally ill. Her name was Brenda, I want to say Brenda Strong. She opened fire in her front yard. Her front yard faced an elementary school. She opened fire on the elementary school with a shotgun. It wasn't with automatic weapons or anything, but she still killed people. And she ended up in prison for it. What was revealed once she was in prison was that her father she was 15 or 16 at the time. Her father had been raping her pretty much every day of her life for her entire life and wouldn't allow her to leave the house. So her act of violence was very much tied to this lifetime of torture. And for men, there are tons of reasons why men commit active violence. I'm going to take you through a few. But it's important to point out that when we're talking about specifically mass shootings and school shootings, that the majority of them have been perpetrated by men. And that is something worth investigating as a sociologist interested in deviance. So U.S. mass shootings in the U.S. from 2009 to 2016, majority of them involved a member of the family or a partner. That hasn't changed with contemporary data. Also, the most common race and ethnicity of mass shooters are white men. Even though our media portrays mass shootings in a different light, white men tend to be the majority of perpetrators. So then here's the number of school shootings. So this was in 2000. This data came out in 2018. The United States at the time had 288 school shootings. The next closest to us was Mexico with 8. Okay, so what motivates a mass shooter? So I'm going to take you through a few different mass shooters and give you some information on them to try and, as I said with the sociological imagination, peel back that onion, peel back the layers, try and figure out what motivates men who are mass shooters. So the first one I have for you is Elliot Rodger. His shooting happened on July at Isla Vista, California, where he killed 7 people and injured 14. His motivation was that he could not find a young woman to have sex with him, and that he was 25 years old, and he did not understand why he was still a virgin at 25. He made a series of YouTube videos where he called women by every name. I'm not going to repeat them, but every awful name you could call a woman, he called them, and said he didn't understand why sluts and whores didn't want to have sex with him. I mean, it's in the sentence, but we can carry on. So to retaliate, he found a sorority in Isla Vista and went home. He had 3 roommates. He went home and killed them by slitting their throats, got his gun, went to the sorority, saw that there were women outside, and just started shooting at them, and ended up killing 4 women plus his 3 roommates, and then injuring 14 other people. He then killed himself. Dylan Roof, some of you may have recognized him. Dylan Roof was the Emmanuel Methodist church shooter. He killed 9 people and injured 1. This was the historically Black church in South Carolina. His motivation was straight racism. He believed that there was going to be a race war and that he needed to be a soldier in that war. Robert Bowers. Oh, sorry, Dylan Roof. The Roof is alive. He didn't kill himself. Robert Bowers was the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. He killed 11 people. He is also alive. His motivation was anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant themes. He very much believed that immigrants and Jewish people were going to take over our country. He tied a lot of his beliefs back to some of the things that the current president had said in tweets, and sort of took that and ran with it and killed 11 people. Adam Lanza, some of you may remember this. He is the Newtown shooter. Newtown, Connecticut was where children were killed. He went into classrooms of elementary school children. He killed 28 people. 20 of them were 6 and 7 years old and injured 2. His motivation, it seems, although it's kind of hard for people to piece together, it seems that he had been living for a long, long time with some mental illnesses that were undiagnosed and may not have had the support he needed, which then resulted in him committing this shooting. Devin Kelly. Devin Kelly is the First Baptist shooter. This was in Sutherland Springs, Texas. His motivation was to get back at his ex-wife. So he went to the church where he thought she was going to be with the intent of killing her. She wasn't there, so he ended up killing 26 people. He injured 20. He died. Somebody pulled out a gun and killed him. But his he had a record of domestic violence. He had a record of rape. He had a record of stalking. So, straight misogyny with him, kind of similar to Elliot Rodger. And then last is Seung-Hui Cho. So this is the Virginia Tech shooting, the Virginia Tech murders. He killed 32 people and he injured 17. He also died during the shooting. He killed himself. Seung-Hui Cho's motivation was a lot of different things. He had some misogyny in there. He was known for stalking girls on campus that he liked. He was known for trying to take pictures up their skirts with cameras, with his cell phone camera, and write kind of creepy messages on their marker boards for their dorm rooms. He wrote really violent fiction that English professors said wasn't just your normal kind of horror writing. It was actually very disturbing. He had some issues with religion. I guess his parents raised him to be very Christian. And when they realized that there was some stuff wrong with him, the hypothesis is that he had a series of mental illnesses, perhaps some schizophrenia that went completely untreated. He was actually committed during his time at Virginia Tech. He was put on a 48-hour lockdown to have his mental health assessed. This is a lot of stuff that he was fighting that led to his shooting people. But when he did this, he made a series of videos talking about how this was because he had been ignored and he hadn't been treated with respect and all of that. So, hegemonic masculinity across the board for all of these men. Seung-Hui Cho I know a lot about. Some of you know this, some of you don't, but I was at Virginia Tech when the shooting happened in 2007. So I was here. This was where I was in graduate school. This is where my graduate school office was. And then the shooting happened over here. Here's a picture of the vigil from that night. So, I know a lot about Seung-Hui Cho just by nature of being there. And school violence for me tends to be pretty interesting because I lived through a school shooting. Okay, so that is all we're going to talk about with Deviance. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all later.